Lavender is sold as the original calm. It is stitched into pillows, dripped into diffusers, pressed into soap meant to evoke something ancient, untouched, and pure. Entire industries rest on that single, simple promise. But lavender did not invent that promise. It inherited it, quietly, almost accidentally, from a plant it was never asked to replace, and a meaning it has spent 2 centuries absorbing into its own name. Today it stands as the most recognized calming scent on earth. And the very success that built that reputation may now be the thing unraveling it. Before we continue, know this. We exist to keep what the world has chosen to forget. This channel was not built to grow loud. It was built to grow long, a vault, not a stage, a record kept for those willing to sit with something slow. If that matters to you, subscribe to Ancient Food Files, not for content, but for preservation. What follows is reconstructed from herbals, trade records, and fields still standing where disease has not yet reached them. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. Now, we open the archive. Lavender's true home is the dry, sun-cracked mountains of the Mediterranean, the high plateaus of Provence, the rocky slopes of Liguria, the limestone hills scattered across the Balearic Islands, and the wind-scoured coastlines of Croatia's Dalmatian Islands, where wild lavender still grows largely unmanaged. Its name comes from the Latin lavare, to wash, because Roman bathers were already adding it to water centuries before anyone wrote down why. Shepherds moving flocks across these high plateaus knew it long before Rome did, rushing past it on seasonal migrations between summer and winter pasture, learning by repetition which slopes held it and when, passing that knowledge down as oral instruction rather than written record. In Iberian dialects it became lavanda, a word that traveled with traders into nearly every Romance language that followed. By the 12th century, the abbess and naturalist Hildegard von Bingen had recorded it in her own herbal writings, recommending it for clarity of mind and noting its strength against household pests. Knowledge gathered the way most early botanical knowledge was. Through use, failure, and careful repetition across generations who had no laboratory to confirm what their hands had already learned. Lavender survives where most plants cannot, and its body is built entirely around that fact. Its narrow, gray-green leaves reduce surface area, cutting water loss and punishing heat. A dense layer of fine hairs traps moisture and reflects sunlight, while tiny glandular structures across its surface produce the essential oil it is famous for, a chemical defense that evaporates in heat, cooling the plant slightly while repelling the insects that might otherwise strip it bare. Beneath the surface, its root system pushes deep into poor, rocky, calcareous soil that would starve most cultivated crops. It blooms in the hottest months, precisely when competing plants retreat, drawing bees and pollinators across an otherwise barren midsummer landscape. Left unpruned, a single lavender plant can survive for decades on a hillside no one tends, regrowing each year from old wood that looks, by midwinter, almost dead. Lavender was never a plant that needed protecting. It was built, from the root up, to need almost nothing at all. That resilience made it useful far beyond bathwater. Roman households used it medicinally as well as ritually. Hildegard's writings carried it into medieval monastic medicine, where monks grew it in walled gardens alongside other plants believed to balance the body's humors. And in the perfume towns of Grasse, in southern France, local lore long held that the region's glovemakers and perfumers, men whose hands were constantly steeped in lavender and other aromatic oils, suffered less during outbreaks of plague than their neighbors. Whether the story is precise history or inherited legend, it persisted for centuries, embedding lavender deeper into Europe's understanding of protection and cleanliness. Centuries later, in Elizabethan and Victorian England, lavender water and dried lavender sachets became fixtures of domestic life, tucked into linen drawers and carriages alike, valued as much for their association with order and respectability as for their scent. English growers around Mitcham, in Surrey, built a regional lavender industry of their own by the 17th century, distinct from Provence but drawing on the same underlying biology. Its modern reputation, though, traces to a single accident. In 1910, French chemist René Maurice Gadifosse burned his hand badly in a laboratory explosion and, reaching for the nearest liquid, plunged it into lavender oil. He later wrote that the burn healed unusually fast, with little scarring and no infection. The observation became the founding anecdote of modern aromatherapy, a term Gadifosse coined decades afterward in a 1937 book bearing that name. Some later accounts, drawn from wartime field medicine, describe lavender oil being used on wounds when conventional antiseptics ran short, a practical use rather than a luxury, born of scarcity rather than scent. Through the 20th century, Provence's lavender fields expanded from scattered wild harvesting into one of France's defining agricultural industries, its purple rose becoming, eventually, a kind of national image, photographed and repeated until the plant itself became shorthand for an entire region's identity. That image, however, was built on a narrowing foundation. To meet rising demand, growers shifted from genetically diverse wild lavender toward clonal cultivars and hybrid lavandin varieties. Plants propagated not from seed but from cuttings of a single high-yield parent, identical down to the chromosome. It made harvests predictable. It also made entire fields, across hundreds of acres, genetically indistinguishable from one another, vulnerable to exactly the kind of disease that diversity would have resisted. In recent decades, a small leafhopper insect has carried a plant pathogen through Provence's fields, causing what growers now call lavender decline. Rose turning gray and dying in patches that spread field by field, season by season, with no cure beyond uprooting, waiting, and replanting in soil that may carry the same risk forward. At the same time, an entirely different kind of replacement was underway. Laboratories learned to synthesize linalool and linalool acetate, the two compounds responsible for most of lavender's scent, without growing a single plant. Cheap, consistent, and infinitely scalable. Synthetic lavender fragrance now fills the majority of products labeled lavender on store shelves, manufactured in volumes no field could ever match. The plant that once helped erase another root's identity from the modern vocabulary is now facing a quieter version of the same erasure, its own name increasingly detached from its own biology, available everywhere, grown almost nowhere. Modern research has, at least, confirmed what centuries of use suggested. Clinical trials on concentrated oral lavender oil preparations have shown measurable reductions in anxiety symptoms, with some studies reporting effects comparable to standard anti-anxiety medications, without the same sedative impairment. Smaller studies on inhaled lavender have reported modest improvements in sleep quality and a measurable lowering of cortisol levels under controlled stress conditions. The mechanism appears tied to linalool's interaction with specific receptor pathways in the nervous system, a chemical explanation. Finally, for an effect monasteries and shepherds had simply trusted for 1,000 years without ever needing to name it. For the families who have farmed Provence's hillsides for generations, the recent decline has not been only economic. Small independent growers, already operating on thin margins, have watched fields their grandparents planted die in patches they cannot fully explain or stop. Many have sold land to larger cooperatives better equipped to manage disease and drought at scale, consolidating what was once dozens of family plots into fewer, larger, more uniform operations. Children raised on these farms increasingly leave for other work, not from disinterest, but because the version of lavender farming that shaped their family's identity is steadily disappearing beneath a more industrial one. The loss, like most cultural loss, is not announced. It simply accumulates, season after season, until one generation realizes the knowledge of which slope, which soil, which year's weather favored a good harvest was never written down, and now has no one left to ask. Climate change is compounding all of it. Lavender tolerates heat and drought better than almost any cultivated plant, yet recent years have tested even that tolerance. Severe Mediterranean droughts through the early 2020s left some Provençal fields blooming late, thin, or not at all, a stress response from a plant that had never needed to plan for scarcity this extreme. A species built for predictable scarcity is now facing unpredictable scarcity, a different, harder problem entirely. Meanwhile, global demand keeps rising, driven by a widening mental health crisis and a public increasingly distrustful of synthetic pharmaceuticals, placing more pressure on fields already struggling to survive their own success. Lavender's strength was always that it could be owned, scaled, and replicated, the very qualities that let it replace what came before it. Now those same qualities are what threaten it. A plant bred for sameness has little defense when the world around it stops staying the same. It never needed permission to grow on a dry hillside with almost nothing in the soil. It never needed a market to justify its roots, or a label to explain its scent. It is only now, surrounded by the systems built to profit from it, that survival has become complicated, and even now, somewhere on an unmanaged slope, untouched by cooperative or cultivar, it is still simply growing, the way it always has, waiting for whoever still knows how to look. If this kind of forgotten history matters to you, consider subscribing to Ancient Food Files, not for growth, but so that what gets buried once does not get buried twice.